Are you trauma bonded? Or have you been in a relationship um, where there was a trauma bond? Trauma bonds are never ending cycles that can really damage your self worth and leave you feeling hopeless. A trauma bond is an attachment to another person, and typically they're mentally abusive, controlling, or violent. Um, 1 minute, and then they offer you affection the next minute. You never really know what you're going to get, right? And yet you seem to not be able to leave. Perhaps you had trauma in childhood. Childhood trauma is often a big precursor to developing trauma bonds and putting up with narcissistic abuse and developing codependency. Okay, so what is trauma bonding? Um, Trauma bonding occurs when someone is in an abusive relationship, often with a narcissist, and they develop a strong attachment to the abuser. Have you ever been in a toxic relationship that was verbally or physically abusive only to leave it and then get right into another one with the same exact unhealthy patterns? Perhaps you've had a toxic environment when you were growing up, and had the same type of relationship with a parent or maybe with a sibling. So trauma bonds in relationships like this just feel like home because it's what you were used to. Unconsciously, you're going to keep repeating the same patterns from your childhood until you learn to deal with the unresolved trauma. So a dysfunctional childhood can lead to trauma bonding, as I said. This behavior can often stem, from childhood, where you were given like positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement in cycles. For example, maybe you were rewarded if you came home with good grades. However, the next day you were punished, and you never really knew like what the day was going to look like. You often felt that your self value was based on performance, right? So if you were one of those kids who played sports and your parents were super strict about the sports, you felt like they only loved you if you were like you made a bunch of baskets at the basketball game, right? That kind of thing. So, and performance based feeling like that often leads to codependency later on because you do the same thing. You want to like please the other person so that you feel good about yourself because that's what you were taught was how to value yourself, and it's not accurate. Okay, so if children grow up in this type of like unpredictable environments, either with like a narcissistic parent or maybe parents who have addictions or anything like that, they're predisposed to forming these trauma bonds later and develop codependency later in adult life. This is why it is so important if you are in a trauma bond and you have children to get out of it because you are simply modeling the behavior that your child is going to pick up on and think that that's appropriate for love. And it's much better to be alone than to model inappropriate behavior for your children. Okay, so next we're going to talk about insecure attachments. This also may lead to trauma bonds, right? So there's more behind trauma bonds than just emotional attachment. When you form a bond with another human being, your brain releases oxytocin. It's a neurotransmitter that's often associated with love. Oxytocin increases the like reliving of traumatic events though in someone with a recent traumatic experience. So this is kind of how the trauma bond forms. Um, but also, like I said, it stems back to childhood. So, like, if you had a neglectful parent or caregiver, or the care was just simply inconsistent, then you could develop what is known as an insecure attachment style. This is the people who also like become avoidant, because you know children with insecure attachments grow into adults, with fearful or avoidant behavior regarding relationships. And suppose you have this type of insecure attachment style. In that case, you are more prone to developing a trauma bond relationship as an adult. If your childhood was dysfunctional, you still loved your parents, but you associate love with toxic behavior or inconsistent care. And so the trauma bonds that you form in adulthood will be similar to the inconsistent care that you received as a child until you heal, those wounds and inner issues. And then you'll learn to set healthy boundaries. And then you'll know that that's not love and it's not appropriate. And you will only accept what is real love and what is appropriate, or you'll be by yourself. Think about it. If you would like cry for milk and be ignored sometimes, and then sometimes you're cuddled up and played with for hours, right? This is just inconsistent. So until you learn new coping skills and deal with the unresolved trauma, you're going to maybe continue to recreate the same like poisonous patterns and trauma bonds with almost every relationship you have. And this can also carry on into your relationship with your children. You could form a toxic trauma bond with them. I've seen like parents who lean on their children for when they're in an abusive relationship, they lean on the child. That destroys a kid. A kid's not supposed to become the peacemaker, in the household. They don't get to enjoy their childhood, therefore they grow up and then they practice that same people-pleasing behavior. You know, they think if they're in control of the environment, then they're safe, and that's not love either. So I'm often asked, like, is trauma bonds real? Yeah, trauma bonds are most certainly real, and a trauma bond in a relationship doesn't have to be romantic in nature. Like I said, you can have these with your siblings, family members, kids, parents, anything, right? But you can even, like with kidnappers, you know, like remember Stockholm syndrome, right? It's a psychological coping mechanism where people who are held captive develop a bond with their captors, and you know, bad people know this. That's why they do it. So when comparing like a trauma bond versus like Stockholm syndrome, a trauma bond doesn't have to be a life-threatening situation though. In contrast with Stockholm syndrome, they form when they fear like their life's in danger, right? This type of trauma bond that victims develop in order to cope with the situation they're living in. It's just a survival technique, right? So what does a trauma bond look like? There are some signs to know if you're wondering if you have a trauma bond, or maybe you're concerned about someone you love being in one. Some of the signs include the abuser isolates the victim, right? That's a big sign. Or they convince family and friends to take their side. They use things like gaslighting and other forms of control. There's a cycle: abuse and love bomb, abuse and love bomb. The victim begins to blame themselves for the abuse. They feel sorry for the abuser. They feel these intense feelings for the abuser, and they literally just refuse to leave them because they feel so bad for the abuser. The victim will defend the abuser to their friends and family, like, no, he's not that bad. He just, you know, had a bad childhood. His dad was a drunk. It's okay. Stuff like that. The victim will threaten to leave, but the abuser promises to change. You know, the victim will keep secrets about the abuse to protect the abuser. And they're usually codependent, and they equate their happiness to the abuser's happiness. So I'm not happy unless I make them happy, you know, so they don't smack me around, that kind of thing. It's sort of like a drug or alcohol addiction. You literally become addicted to the abuse and the abuser. Sometimes, even if you found a way to escape the specific abuser, this trauma bond is so strong, you will find it challenging to move on and maybe even continue to think about them. But just remember, this is not love. You're not thinking about them because of love. You're thinking about them because of the oxytocin that you formed, which feels like love, but it's not the same thing. So if you feel like you are trauma bonded, you might want to seek professional help. You can find you a therapist or a coach that, you know, can help you get some of these things out. Even after you escape a trauma bond relationship, if you don't heal your own issues, you're just going to magnetize in another trauma bond. And that's the whole point. You're going to be in a cycle. If you don't heal, you will never get away from that, and you'll constantly be stuck in codependent relationships with not so great people. So work on yourself, right? That's how we heal. Don't forget to join my free Telegram group. The link should be in the box below.